Mist gathered low over the desert as if the earth itself were exhaling after a long night, silvering the sage and turning every fence post into a ghost of itself. Calder Boone stood on his porch with his boots unlaced, breath frosting the dawn, watching the slim figure by the rail. Ayanna Redbird was little more than a silhouette carved from shadow and early light, her braids swaying softly in the breeze. She didn't turn when she spoke, and her voice, quiet, scraped thin from too much silence, carried straight to him. "I'll leave at dawn. I am nothing but a burden." The words landed between them like a dropped stone, sending ripples he feared he might never still, and something inside him tightened as though the moment itself balanced on the edge of breaking. He stepped off the porch, gravel crunching under his heel, but she didn't look back. Instead, she pressed her palm against the top beam of the fence, tracing a groove worn by decades of rains and rope burns. She said the sheriff had come the night before, his lantern glaring in her eyes, his voice thick with warning. Folks in town didn't trust her, didn't want her here, didn't understand why Calder had taken her in after finding her half-starved on the plains 6 months earlier. Ayanna kept her gaze fixed on the horizon as she relayed the words, though he could hear how each one still clung to her like burrs on cloth. She said she didn't want to ruin his good standing, didn't want to be the reason people whispered his name with pity. Her shoulders curled inward as if bracing for rejection, though she pretended her body simply chilled in the breeze. He watched the way her breath hitched, realizing she was preparing to disappear before anyone could ask her to. Calder reached the fence rail beside her, resting his hand not on her but near enough to let her feel he had chosen to stand beside her, not behind. He asked why she thought she had to go, though he already knew the shape of the answer. Ayanna told him the sheriff claimed trouble followed people like her. People who didn't quite belong anywhere, people the world decided to misunderstand. She said she was tired of being stared at, tired of feeling like she carried a shadow that stretched across Calder's ranch without permission. Her voice trembled at the edges, not from fear but from a lifetime of swallowing her own worth. She admitted she'd rather leave before he asked her to, before she saw disappointment settle into his eyes. Calder felt something fierce flare beneath his ribs, a protective ache he'd been trying to keep quiet, and he wondered how she couldn't see what he saw when he looked at her. She finally turned toward him, and in the pale morning light he saw the faint bruise of exhaustion beneath her eyes. Ayanna had spent months tending his horses, mending his fences, helping in ways so subtle he often didn't notice until hours later, when something in his home felt a little gentler. He told her the sheriff's prejudice wasn't truth, only fear wearing a badge. But she shook her head, gaze dropping toward the dust around her boots. She said animals were easier. They didn't judge, didn't remember old stories, didn't care about bloodlines or borders. They listened with their bodies, not their pride. She trusted horses more than people because horses never made her feel like she was something to be endured. Calder watched her stroke the mane of his mare, Willow, the animal leaning into her with quiet devotion. He wondered how someone who believed herself a burden could inspire that kind of trust, and the thought unsettled him in ways he couldn't yet name. He told her about Mara, his sister, gone now 3 years, and how the town had whispered about her too. Mara had always taken in strays, lost dogs, lonely drifters, broken travelers who needed a meal or a night's shelter. People had called her foolishly tender, too soft for a land that rewarded hardness. Their judgment, he said, had carved her down long before illness carried her away. Ayanna listened, brow furrowing with something like recognition. Calder admitted he couldn't stand the thought of another good soul being whittled small by other people's fear. The confession wasn't meant to bind Ayanna to him, only to show her she wasn't as alone as she believed. She looked up then, truly meeting his gaze, and something fragile flickered across her face, hope wrestling with disbelief. The wind tugged a strand of hair across her cheek, and Calder's hand lifted of its own accord, tucking it gently behind her ear. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. She said leaving wasn't about wanting to, it was about survival. If she stayed, the sheriff would watch her, the townsfolk would mutter, and trouble, real or imagined, would be tied to her name. Calder countered that running wouldn't save her from judgment, it would only confirm the stories other people wrote for her. She studied the carved bird he placed into her palm, the one she had whittled months ago and secretly dropped near the barn door, believing he'd never notice. He told her he kept it in his pocket on the hard days because it reminded him of quiet resilience. Ayanna's fingers curled around it as though she were afraid it might vanish like everything else she'd ever tried to hold. She whispered that she didn't know how to stay without fear. Calder told her no one did. Staying was always an act of bravery disguised as stillness. She said if she were to have any claim to staying, she needed to face the sheriff, to stand in the open where she'd been made to feel small. Calder agreed but said she wouldn't go alone. So they saddled Willow and rode into town, the early sun warming the dirt road as they approached the cluster of wooden buildings. Faces turned as they passed, some curious, some cold, some pitying. Ayanna straightened her spine despite the tremor in her hands, and Calder stayed half a pace behind her, close enough to steady her without overshadowing her courage. Sheriff Dalton Crowe stepped from his office when they arrived, jaw tight, hand resting on his belt with the casual threat of authority. Ayanna spoke before he could, telling him she wouldn't run and wouldn't apologize for earning her keep. Her voice wavered once but didn't break. The sheriff studied her, surprise flickering through the stern lines of his face, then lowered his hand from his belt. He said Calder's choices were his own, and as long as Ayanna caused no trouble, he'd reconsider his stance. It wasn't acceptance but it was space she had carved for herself by refusing to shrink. When they turned to leave, Ayanna exhaled so deeply her shoulders trembled. She asked Calder if courage always felt like breaking open. He said yes, and sometimes that was the point. On the ride home, she leaned unconsciously toward him, the gesture small yet profound, as though the desert sun had melted a layer of fear she'd been carrying for years. When they reached the ranch, Calder prepared a simple meal, hands careful, movements quiet. Ayanna watched him, noticing the way he masked his worry with steadiness, the way he glanced at her as though checking she hadn't vanished. He offered her the stew, their fingers brushing, and the touch sent warmth up her arm like a slow-burning ember catching. She admitted she'd survived so long she had forgotten how to imagine a future. Calder told her survival wasn't the end of the story, living was. She lowered her forehead to his chest, allowing herself to be held with a vulnerability that felt like standing unarmed in a storm. His arms closed around her with such gentle certainty she wondered how she had ever mistaken herself for a burden. Later, beneath a sky blooming with stars, they stood by the corral while Willow grazed nearby. The night hummed with possibility. Calder lifted Ayanna's hand and said she didn't need him as a reason to stay, she could stay because she deserved a life free of fear. She whispered she wanted both, a life here and someone who saw her without flinching. He kissed her forehead softly, a promise rather than a claim. He asked in a voice as steady as the land beneath them if she'd marry him, not out of rescue but out of respect, partnership, and the quiet love that had grown between them in the small gestures of shared days. Tears shimmered on her lashes and she nodded, letting herself believe she could belong somewhere without apology. Calder drew her close as the desert wind swept past, carrying their vow across the plains like a whispered blessing. But even in the safety of his arms, Ayanna sensed this was only the beginning, only the first step toward a life where dignity could grow roots deep enough to weather any storm. And as she closed her eyes, listening to Calder's heartbeat steady as a drum, she understood that staying was not the end of her journey, but the doorway to a future she had never dared to imagine, the kind of future that beckoned with both tenderness and uncertainty, urging her onward.